Lots to cover this evening, but first, some breaking news. After a years-long legal battle, the remains of Archbishop Fulton Sheen have been transferred from New York to Peoria, Illinois. Sheen's niece, Joan Sheen Cunningham, and Diocese of Peoria attorney Patricia Gibson gathered at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to disinter the remains of Sheen. They were then flown to O'Hare, where they were transported to the Peoria Diocese. Now, the Diocese of Peoria said the beatification process for Sheen has resumed. Sheen was an El Paso, Illinois native, ordained as a priest in Peoria in 1919. He later moved to New York, where he became an early televangelist on radio and later television. Bishop Daniel Janke said he's hopeful Sheen will be beatified this year. And a private meeting involving mostly German-speaking prelates and experts was held in Rome this week to discuss the upcoming Amazonian Synod. Now, according to the Holy See spokesman, Alessandro Gisotti, the gathering was a study meeting of the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network, but he said he was unable to give details about the participants. The Synod's working document released last week has been heavily criticized for what some say is excessive emphasis on ecological conversion and controversially proposing a married priesthood. Joining us now, Edward Pentin of the National Catholic Register. He discovered exactly who was at that secret meeting and why it matters. Edward Pentin joins us from Rome. Ed, thanks for being here. Who exactly was at this meeting, and why are some in Rome so concerned, Ed?
Well, it was made up, Raymond, of primarily European experts, bishops, to discuss the upcoming synod and preparation for it. I understood later that one of the key issues to be discussed was the ordination of married men to cater for the shortage of priests in parts of the Amazon. That was a key area that they were trying to prepare for the synod. But it was the interesting point about this was its sort of secretive nature. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't advertised in any way, and also the high level of particularly German-speaking bishops involved in this.
And you had, and we'll run through them. You can explain who these people are for those who might not know. You had really headlining this Cardinal Humas, who is the general relator of the synod. Why is his presence important?
Yes, well, Cardinal Claudio Humes has for a long time pushed this idea of ordination of married men, not just, I think he supports it not just in the Amazon. I think he'd like this for the universal church. At least that's the signals he's given over the years. And he's actually the general relator of the synod, so he's basically the man in charge of it. But there are also other members who people found very concerning. That's Bishop Erwin Kreutler, who's an Austrian bishop who spent many years in Brazil. He's also in favor of this ordination of married men, but also women priests. And there are others too who drew concern, particularly the German bishop, who is in charge of a lot of money that the German bishops give to Latin America. And so there's some concern that there's sort of a money going towards this synod from Germany, and with it, sort of German agenda for the church.
Now, you also had Cardinal Baldessari, who is the General Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, as well as Cardinal Casper, Walter Casper there, who was such a driving force in that family synod. Your reaction to their presence, and what do you think is the through line here?
Right, well, Cardinal Baldessari is kind of expected. He's the Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, so he needs to be there to really guide, I suppose, what's going to go into the Synod. What's interesting about that as a sideline is that I actually called the Synod of Bishops to ask if the person there knew about this meeting, or there was a meeting like this in Rome, and he denied all knowledge of it. And the other person you mentioned, well, there's Cardinal Schönborn was also invited, although he was too ill to come.
Right.
But there are others too who I think were of concern, and it very much there's nobody really there of a particularly Orthodox view of the church, and I think that's what drew a lot of concern.
Ed, is there any Orthodox organized group challenging the ideas of this working document?
Well, one of the groups that has set up to try and offer some critique of this is the Tradition, Family and Property movement, which has obviously came from Brazil. Its founder was from Brazil. Many of its members come from Latin America, and they've studied this for a long time. They're particularly experts in liberation theology and the dangers of liberation theology, and they've been very vocal about this. They've even set up a website called Pan-Amazonian Synod Watch, and they're really wanting to show the problems that they see are in this synod. But we've heard other critics too come out, including today Cardinal Walter Brandmüller.
I'm going to get to that.
A very strong critique.
We're going to get to that in a moment, Ed. I don't want you taking all the winds out of our sails here. Bishop Franz Josef Overbeck, who is of Essen, Germany. He's the head of the German Bishops' Latin American Commission. And as you point out in your piece, Bishop Overbeck said the Synod will lead the Church, quote, to a point of no return, and thereafter nothing will be the same as it was. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's not clear, but the suspicion is that the German bishops are really wanting to use this synod to push through their agenda, which is to basically change the Church's teaching on morality, particularly sexual morality. And there's a sense that is the goal of the German bishops, and the fact that he said that shows that perhaps that's true, that there is a scheme, if you like, to use this synod to get through these agendas through the back door, and their kind of ideology for the Church, which as others say, and many senior clergy have said to me that they think is wrong, and it's purely projecting their own vision on the Church.
Well, according to Cardinal Baldessari, who is the Synod Secretary, he says this is going to be a time of, quote, pastoral reflection open to recognizing diversity and listening to the Amazonian reality with all its cultural and ecclesial facets. Why have a synod when the outcome seems already determined, Ed? This feels like the family synod routine all over again.
Well, that's it, Raymond. I mean, that's another concern, that this has already been predetermined. What's quite interesting is that one of the key bodies connected with this synod was actually started long before the synod was announced, back in 2014. It's called REPAM. It was set up by Caritas, and it's headed by Cardinal Humes. And it seems as though there's been this agenda for quite some time to try and to use this synod to get through a lot of things which were put at bay during the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And I think that seems fairly clear. Now, it should be said that there are elements here which people support, and that I think any Catholic would support. That people do think there are things we can learn, of course, from the indigenous people. But I think there's a lot of concern that they're being used essentially and exploited to get to further these ideas and this agenda. And I think that's causing a lot of concern. And there's not much that's been said to kind of allay those fears.
Yeah, it's kind of a Trojan horse. Cardinal Walter Brandmüller, who you mentioned a moment ago, he told LifeSite News, it is impossible to conceal that this synod intends especially to help implement two most cherished projects that heretofore have never been implemented, namely the abolishment of celibacy and the introduction of a female priesthood, starting with female deacons. He continues, the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document, contradicts the binding teaching of the Church in decisive points and thus has to be qualified as heretical. Inasmuch as the divine revelation is being questioned or misunderstood, one also has to speak additionally of apostasy. Ed Pentin, apostasy, heretical. What's your reaction to this? And is Brandmüller being ignored or taken seriously in his critique?
Well, it's hard to say. It only came out this morning, and I haven't really heard about much reaction. But I think people will take this seriously, especially those obviously who already have some concerns. But I think he's said same things also that the Traditional Family and Property said, which is that, again, he says that they're using the gospel basically to push through this agenda, and that it doesn't really have much to do with the gospel. It has the emphasis is primarily, they think, on the indigenous people and really listening. It talks a lot about listening to the indigenous people, but not a lot about evangelization and conversion to the faith. And I think that's his main concern. I mean, he's very strong. He talks about a perversion of enculturation in this document, and he says it needs to be rejected decisively. So he's very very strong and very critical of it, and really thinks that it's just promoting a sort of natural religion and pantheism, and he sees there's really very little there which is authentically Catholic.
Yeah, Brandmuller also says, we're listening to a population of, roughly half the size of Mexico City. And my feeling is, look, if we need to, if we want to learn about living off the land and communing with nature and, living in off the grid, surely these are people to be listened to. But if we're talking about theology or even civilization, advanced civilization, these people are living, cut off from the rest of the world. So I'm not sure exactly what lessons they have to give the church at large, much less Rome. But I guess this remains to be seen. We'll be watching in October, Edward. I want to move on one before I let you go. Pope Francis is planning to receive the Order of Malta's Grand Master in a private audience on Friday. This is their first meeting since Fra Giacomo, he's the Grand Master, banned public liturgies in the extraordinary form for the order, the Latin Mass, essentially. First, what was the reaction in Rome to that decision, and how do you think people, do they believe that Pope Francis might have had a hand in this decision?
Well, again, it's always who you talk to, Raymond, in Rome, what their reaction is. Certainly among those who are favour tradition more, they were really shocked and very angered by this, and they thought it was completely unnecessary. They thought it actually obviously increases divisions rather than heals them, because now you've got a very disenfranchised and disenchanted part of the church in the Knights of Malta. But whether it came from Pope Francis, people don't know. It seems kind of unlikely that it did come from the Holy Father, because he's actually quite, I wouldn't say ambivalent about the Old Mass, but he doesn't take a whole lot of interest in the liturgy. And I think it's most probably, at least what I hear, is that it's come from the higher-ups in the Knights of Malta, and particularly the Grand Chancellor, Albrecht von Boeselager, who's long been pushing for a sort of more secular image of the order, if you like, moving away from more religious aspects. So I think it primarily comes from him and from those around him, rather than perhaps the Pope himself.
Edward Pentin, as always, thank you for your reporting. And you can find Edward's fine reporting in the National Catholic Register at ncregister.com or on Twitter at Edward Pentin. Thank you, Ed. We'll check in with you soon.